Welcome to our second video in the Rise and Fall of Cardinal Wolsey virtual summit. Now, having heard about the early years of Wolsey and his rise to power, we will now hear from Professor Catherine Fletcher. Now, Catherine is a Professor of History at Manchester Metropolitan University, and she's also an AHRC BBC New Generation thinker. Catherine specialises in Renaissance and early modern European history, especially but not exclusively that of the Italian peninsula. She is the author of 4 books on 16th century European history, including The Divorce of Henry VIII, The Untold Story, and The Black Prince of Florence, The Spectacular Life and Treacherous World of Alessandro de' Medici. And her latest book is The Beauty and the Terror, an alternative history of the Italian Renaissance. Well, as far as my chat with Catherine is concerned, the year is 1528. Henry VIII is desperate for a son and heir. His current wife, Catherine of Aragon, has passed childbearing age despite enduring multiple pregnancies. The couple only have one surviving child, Princess Mary. At the same time, the king has become infatuated with a certain Anne Boleyn and declares his intention to set aside his marriage to Catherine. So without further ado, let's join Catherine and I in conversation as we talk about Wolsey's involvement in what became known at the time as the King's Great Matter, and how Wolsey, as the King's First Minister, desperately tried, but ultimately failed to deliver to Henry VIII his longed-for annulment. So hello Catherine and welcome, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us today as part of this 490th celebration of Cardinal Wolsey's life and death. Can we start by you setting the scene for us around the events that evolved around the King's Great Matter and Henry VIII seeking a divorce from Catherine of Aragon? What was the impetus behind those events, and who were in fact the key players?
Well, by this point, Henry's been on the throne for coming on for 20 years and he hasn't got a male heir. And this is a real problem in Henry's mind. And Henry starts to get into his head that perhaps he's somehow offended God by marrying his brother's widow. And that's Catherine of Aragon. And this becomes a key part of the story. Catherine was initially married to Henry's older brother Arthur. Arthur died very young. Henry became the heir instead, and he married Catherine. Now, this is all supposed to have been sorted out in terms of paperwork. So a lot of paperwork involved around royal marriages, dispensations, permission to marry your brother's widow. But of course, there's no child. Well, there's one child, of course, there's Mary, the daughter, but there isn't a son. And the Tudors are a pretty new dynasty. They're concerned, Henry's concerned, that there are real implications for the stability of the kingdom if a woman has to be in charge. Who's the husband going to be? Would it be one of the English nobility? Would it be a foreigner who might try and come in and lord it over England? I mean, there are loads of problems, right? There are big problems. I mean, the idea of putting a woman in charge and just letting her get on with it is not really something we go for in this period. So Henry starts to get a bit nervous around this, and around about the same time, a woman called Anne Boleyn comes on the scene, and Henry is very attracted to Anne Boleyn. And this kind of combination of potentially there's another interesting woman in the picture, and there's this problem with the heir, starts to kind of coalesce. Now, at this point, Cardinal Wolsey is Henry's chief minister. He's been in Henry's service for a long time. He actually initially comes to court under Henry's father, Henry VII. So Cardinal Wolsey is going to be the person who's got the job of sorting this out. But diplomatically speaking, it's very complicated because royal marriages in this period are made for political reasons. Henry's married to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine is a Spanish princess. So this is not just like, personally, things not working with my wife. I'm terribly sad about it, but I'm going to divorce you and marry somebody else. It's got major kind of international political ramifications, what he's tried to do. And this brings in Catherine's nephew, Charles V. He's the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Spain. Charles is basically the most powerful man in Europe. He rules over Spain, the German lands, Austria, the Netherlands, which is a huge empire. And it brings in Charles's big rival, Francis I, who's the King of France. These guys are at war. I mean, you think Brexit is chaotic, politically speaking. I mean, you know, they really are getting into something that's not just about the personalities of the individuals involved in the divorce. It's about all this kind of spread of political implications.
Yeah, but there had been precedents, hadn't there, for royal separations in the past, but this one, and so I think Henry thought that it was all going to be fairly straightforward, but...
Yeah, well, you know, there are quite a few royal divorces about. Henry's sister, Margaret Tudor, she gets divorced. Charles VIII of France, his wife, Anne of Brittany, had to be divorced from Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor. Lucretia Borgia, very famously, gets divorced from her husband Giovanni Sforza, which is where he then, you know, throws back all the allegations of incest and so on in the Borgia family. That's where those come from. So the idea of royal divorces, where there's political reasons for them, where both spouses can agree or can be persuaded that it's in their best interest to agree, these things happen. And the way they happen is that you get the Pope to find some kind of technicality in the paperwork, and then everybody agrees. So it's not quite divorce in the modern sense. It's annulment, or it's this declaration that the marriage was never valid in the first place, which is actually the exact thing that Henry is looking for.
So with those other royal divorces, we could reasonably expect that that's what Henry was hoping would happen in this instance.
Yeah, and you have to remember Henry is the King of England and he's used to getting his own way. I mean, within England, yeah, people push back against him every now and again, but, you know, he's in charge. So having to go to the Pope, who's the supranational sort of judicial authority on these things, and ask for favours, well, you know, that's a little bit awkward or uncomfortable when you're a king. You expect people just to come back and say, yes, of course, you know, my lord, can I you know, your Majesty, can I help you? And so I think Henry starts off by assuming that, you know, this can be done.
Yes.
And gets increasingly agitated as he realises that it isn't as simple as he hoped.
Yes. Why do you think Wolsey was so blindsided by the appearance of Anne Boleyn as a serious threat or player in this whole sequence of events?
I think from Wolsey's point of view, if you're used to dealing in international politics, you see that there are models for a royal mistress that Anne Boleyn could have followed. So in France, for example, you have somebody like Diane de Poitiers, who becomes the mistress of Henry II, Henry II. She's somebody who exerts enormous power at court, but she doesn't aspire to marry the monarch. And she understands that he's going to have a wife who's going to be a dynastic match and all the rest of it. So I think, coming at it from Wolsey's point of view, if you look at the international examples that are around you, there's a place where Anne Boleyn could fit, and it's not as wife. It's that as that kind of what French would call maîtresse en titre, the kind of official mistress to the king. Like that's where she should be, and everything else is that when she doesn't behave like that, when it starts to become apparent that actually she's potentially the new bride, this is really not the way things are meant to go.
And why was Wolsey at the centre of all this? What can we say about his diplomatic experience and his international connections that made him apparently best suited for this role?
There's a little bit of tension actually to start with about who is going to be in charge of the diplomacy around the divorce, because we start off with Wolsey running the kind of secret trial in May 1527 in England, and that suddenly gets thrown into chaos when news comes from Rome that the Pope has been effectively captured and placed under siege in his own castle. I think we're going to come on to that later on, but hold that thought, the situation in Rome is not good. So Wolsey's initial plan that he's going to examine the case himself and come to some conclusions and perhaps, you know, make an initial judgment which can then effectively be sort of signed off by the Pope, that clearly isn't going to work out. Henry then sort of does his own thing slightly behind Wolsey's back and sends his own man off to Rome, who, not unsurprisingly, gets nowhere. This is a guy called William Knight. And Wolsey has to sort of rescue the whole thing and say, hang on, I do know what I'm doing. I've got quite an extensive background in diplomacy. I mean, you know, Wolsey really has, he's sort of brokered international treaties. He essentially runs the English diplomatic service. Henry has got resident diplomats in quite a number of places, not necessarily really long-term and impermanent officers like we have them now, but he's developing, you know, quite a serious network of overseas intelligence and information. So Wolsey is the obvious person to be able to handle this in the way it needs to be handled, but Henry actually starts off sort of sidelining him a little bit, and then Wolsey pulls things back.
Why do you think he does that? Why do you think Henry goes off and sends his own person off to Rome?
It's not absolutely clear what's going on in Henry's head at this time, I have to say. I mean, it's sometimes difficult to work out why these decisions are being taken. I think perhaps he just thinks, send somebody out there, get the paperwork, get it done quickly, have him come back. But I think it is a bit of a sign that perhaps Wolsey is being a little bit more cautious initially than Henry is being about getting this done. And I think one of the things that Wolsey understands is that for the divorce to be recognised as legitimate and not a sort of quick botched job that could be challenged later on, you really don't want the legitimacy of any new heir to be challenged in future, which means the divorce has to be done properly and legally. So Wolsey's like, let's not cut corners here. We actually have to do things properly. And I think perhaps that's where some of the tension comes in.
Maybe impatient to begin with.
Perhaps a little bit impatient. I mean, he sends Knight off to try and see if Knight can get these various dispensations sorted out. And Knight's mission is just chaotic, partly because there's a war going on the Italian peninsula. Knight fears he's being spied on. He gets to Rome. He can't get in to see the Pope. None of this works. The Pope's effectively being held captive by soldiers loyal to the Holy Roman Empire. So loyal to Catherine of Aragon's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. So, you know, the political situation is not at all friendly to Henry, and Knight, who doesn't know what he's doing in Rome at all, you know, can't find a way through to get an audience with the Pope. So therefore we come back to Wolsey, who actually does know what he's doing in terms of having accredited diplomats set up in Rome who he can deploy to try and to try and get things under control.
What kind of politician was Wolsey? And in fact, did he really truly support the divorce from Catherine of Aragon?
I think that Wolsey's whole career has been built on efficiently delivering what Henry VIII wants. If you go right back to very early on in Henry VIII's reign, one of the ways that Wolsey consolidates his power at court over older advisors like William Warham and Richard Fox is by agreeing to Henry's plan to go to war with France. And some of the other advisors are more cautious. Wolsey's like, no, we can do this. And Wolsey's, you know, not from a noble background. He's from, you know, famously the son of a butcher. I mean, how exactly true this is a whole other question. Yes, but, you know, that's what is said about him. So his whole position derives from his loyalty to Henry and his ability to get Henry what Henry wants. And this is why the divorce, it says, is so dangerous for him, because it becomes apparent Henry can't just snap his fingers and have, you know, the correct paperwork back from the Pope to say, oh yeah, we found that technicality that your marriage was never valid, there you go. And that's what Henry wants. And Wolsey can't magic it up.
What was going on in Rome at the time that made things more complex than anticipated?
There's been over 30 years of on-off war on the Italian peninsula. So Italy at this time is not one state, it's divided into 5 large states, which are Naples, the Papal States run by the Pope, Milan, Florence and Venice, and a whole lot more small states. and it's a very wealthy place. And France and Spain, and remember Spain, through the person of Charles V, is allied with the rest of the Holy Roman Empire, have been at war for power and influence over the different Italian states. Those wars have been going on since 1494. They're very, very complicated. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of switching sides. But the thing you need to know is that basically France and the Empire are fighting it out. And by the time we get to the late 1520s, the Empire is winning. Charles V is consolidating his power in Italy, and in particular is consolidating power in such a way as to make himself an attractive ally to Pope Clement VII. Now,
Right.
the Pope in Rome is the Pope, leader of the Catholic Church, ruler of a large swathe of Italy in the form of the Papal State, so effectively the prince of the country, and Clement is a member of the Medici family, the historic de facto ruling family of Florence. So he's got his fingers in a lot of pies, and he's got his own agenda. He's got his own agenda so far as the church is concerned, so far as the church lands are concerned, and so far as his family's home state is concerned. So when Henry goes to Clement to, for saying yes or no over a divorce, Clement is not a neutral individual here. He is a person with a political agenda, and particularly in May of 1527, when this all really kicks off, there's just been a mutiny by imperial troops in Rome. They've sacked the city. I mean, it's just like a horrific sort of set of atrocities that go on in Rome that I won't describe in detail, but it's pretty awful. I mean, it's awful. People are killed, people are tortured, people are kind of kidnapped and taken hostage. People are fleeing for safety. It's like really horrific attack on the city.
I think that's one of the things that struck me, because we hear, the sack of Rome, and it's kind of an easy thing to say in a sentence, but when you read your book, you just sort of begin to realise that it was horrific.
It was absolutely horrific for the people involved, and there are some dreadful stories of torture that I don't particularly want to recount in detail, but you have to understand that it's on the kind of psychological level of something like 9/11. If you want a modern comparator, that's probably as close as you get. So you had to think imagine you were trying to do some diplomacy in New York in September 2001, and in the middle of that,
and nobody's paying it. Nobody wants to listen.
Of course, nobody wants. Everybody is preoccupied with the horrific things that have just happened. There was a lot of talk in Rome in 1527 about how this is sort of God's vengeance on a corrupt church, that we need to kind of reform ourselves, we need to do better in future, perhaps we shouldn't be just handing out political favours. You can see how all this sort of plays in. And Clement, in the middle of this, has effectively been forced to retreat pretty much under siege to the Castel Sant'Angelo, which is his fortress on the Tiber. People aren't being allowed in and out to see him. This is the scenario in which...
I guess he fears for his life, right?
Well, I think it would be politically difficult for somebody just to assassinate the Pope. I mean, that would probably be going a little bit too far. And there is evidence that Charles V is actually slightly embarrassed by the fact that his troops appear to have taken the Pope hostage, and he is the Holy Roman Emperor.
Yes,
he's meant to be quite holy and Roman. He's not really meant to just kidnapping the Pope is not sort of what you're meant to do. So eventually this all plays out, and Clement is allowed to escape, and he goes out of Rome up to Orvieto, which is a very nice little papal palace, although not very well equipped for the full sort of college of cardinals, all court and retinue. When the English ambassadors turn up the next year, they say it's full of riffraff. And they talk about how run down it is compared to what they expect at the papal court.
Right.
But there you have Clement in a very vulnerable political position, needing to cut deals, and importantly needing to cut deals both in terms of Rome and Florence with Catherine of Aragon's side in the divorce.
Yeah. And the other thing that strikes me in all of this, because as somebody who loves the Tudors, from an English perspective, Henry becomes like the centre of everything. But When you describe the events you described, and when you look at it from an Italian Roman perspective, it's just this sort of kind of relatively minor player somewhere in the north of Europe. I would have thought he's not one of the two big princes of Europe from Rome's point of view.
No, and from Clement's point of view, you know, this is just really inconvenient time. Look, I'm very busy right now. You know, I've been forced out of Rome. My family's been forced out of Florence. I want to get back into Rome. I want to get my family back into power in Florence. I could really do without this irritation. Can't the King of England just take this woman as his mistress and get on with it? You know, everybody else, can he not just be sensible like everybody else, you know, would do in this situation? He doesn't have to marry her. Yeah. You know, there are ways around this. I mean, in Italy, the other thing that's very common in Italy is legitimising illegitimate children. So, from an Italian point of view, you look at the Duke of Richmond. Yeah. There's a potential heir.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yes. You see it from very different eyes when you just take a moment to step into those shoes, I think. Quite unusually, England had an Italian ambassador in Rome at the time, a man called Gregorio Casali. I was really interested to read about him in your book about this ambassador. And one of the intriguing questions is how did an Italian get involved in English affairs? How did that come about?
There's quite a tradition of England employing Italian expertise to do business in Rome, because doing business in Rome is really complicated. It involves knowing who to bribe, knowing how to get the paperwork through very complex processes at the court of Rome, knowing exactly who's who in all the offices of the papal court. And there are some Englishmen who've done that. For example, Wolsey's predecessor as the English cardinal, Christopher Bainbridge, actually moved his whole household over to Rome, became a courier cardinal on the spot, and looked after the English business in Rome. But obviously, when Wolsey became a cardinal, he was already, you know, tied to having a strong interest in staying at the English court. He didn't want to move to Rome. So what does he do? He finds expert people to do that business for him, to essentially be the English fixers in Rome. One of those follows in the footsteps of previous bishops of Worcester. So there's an interesting thing where the bishops of Worcester, over a period of time, were often Italians, and they got the income from the bishopric of Worcester in return for doing this diplomatic business in Rome. So Casali is a slightly different case because he's not a cleric. He is a layman. He's from a senatorial family in Bologna, and he's actually first come over to the English court in the entourage of Cardinal Campeggio when Wolsey was looking after all the negotiations for the Treaty of London in 1518-19. And Casali is obviously quite this sort of bright young man. Comes to Henry's attention, is knighted. He starts doing these kind of informal diplomatic missions, going to and from the northern courts in Italy, getting horses and hawks and hounds, and looking after all that kind of hunting side of gifts between these courts that, you know, Henry likes a lot. So when they need somebody who's a kind of bright, young, up-and-coming, well-connected political person in Rome to do that ambassadorial role of fixing and hosting a lot of the special envoys who come over from England for specific missions, they give the job to him.
That's absolutely fascinating. I didn't know. So he came, he'd been in London, he'd met Henry, he would have been at the English court, familiar with the English court and the players there.
Yeah, he did a couple of stints in England before he got appointed ambassador. I think one for around about a year probably, and another one for 6 months when he's staying in the house of people associated with the Medici in London. So he's got, you know, these really, really solid connections between the papal family, but he's got connections in Bologna and in Rome. His brother actually gets the job of English ambassador in Venice for a while. So there's, you know, he really has got himself into Henry's favour.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I suppose one of the other things that was really intriguing me was how did Wolsey go about exerting his control over the ambassador in Rome at such a distance?
I mean, your absolute fastest turnaround time through all these negotiations is a month to get a letter from Rome to London and back again.
Right.
And that's when things are going well.
Okay.
And often they are going well. I mean, Wolsey absolutely loses it a few times over a whole kind of business of letters getting lost and people not being careful enough with letters and with the post. You know, apparently there's one courier who just tosses a packet of letters over the wall at Calais because the gates are closed after curfew. And so yeah, they argue about post and letters more than anything else. It's actually really, really difficult. So, so this all depends on trust, on your diplomats having a level of latitude, not necessarily to come to agreements, but to float ideas and to make suggestions, perhaps sometimes off the record, where you have plausible deniability. You know, how would it sound if we did this, this and this? And so you really have to leave people to it. And this is where a lot of the issues around, you know, mistrust and are people getting too close to their host court come in. And you start to see that a little bit later on, particularly after the fall of Wolsey, when Cromwell, who obviously succeeds Wolsey, is much more suspicious of the English ambassadors in Rome than Wolsey has been, and doesn't, you know, they're kind of Wolsey's men. He's chosen them, of course, you know, he knows what he's doing. He wouldn't have picked anybody who wasn't reliable, but Cromwell doesn't come in with anything like that same assumption.
I see. And what did Wolsey look for in an ambassador? What was his kind of, you know, requisites for the job? Well,
there's a particular thing they say about Casale, which is that he has access, credit and reputation. So he's got access to all the important people in Rome. So he some of his English colleagues who come over on special missions will talk about the fact that he's always got cardinals dropping round for dinner. His house is sort of furnished with gentlemen who are the best in Rome. He obviously entertains. He, you know, links up the English special envoys to go out hunting with particular cardinals who might be influential. So he does a lot of that fixing job. He will go and have conversations with the Pope. He will sort of know who you need to bribe. He will know how to, you know, all this sort of gossip is, you know, which cardinal's mistress might be potentially indiscreet. Okay. All these kind of details that you need to know to get things done in this very complex political environment. You know, who might you be able to blackmail? Who will steal you a letter from the papal files? And what do you need to bribe them with? I mean, what do they want? Cash? Do they want, you know, entertainment? What sort of entertainment? There's all these.
Do you think?
Stories.
I mean, that's interesting. You know, do you think that it would be any different if this played out today?
Well, I think today we have a lot more rules governing some of the official side of diplomacy. So this is very early days in terms of that idea of having a resident long-term ambassador. That's quite a new concept. That line between when your officially accredited diplomats stop and your secret services start isn't so clear. So people who, like Casale, who are officially accredited diplomats, will do things like set up some of the special operations to try and steal Catherine of Aragon's letters going to the Pope. Steal stuff, get it, the cipher decoded. There's all this sort of business going on. So it's not quite as clear dividing line between diplomacy and secret service as it would be now, but you see a lot of the same things going on.
And I guess this is where those letters of Henry VIII were stolen and ended up in the Vatican, I guess. This is in part of this process.
Yes, exactly. I don't think we know exactly how they got there or who precisely, you know, picked them up and packed them up and took them away. But yeah, absolutely. They, you know, people really want to get copies of the correspondence that's going around.
Now, moving on a bit, back in England, perhaps we could touch on the great trial at Blackfriars, which was a pretty historic event. Can you explain how that came about?
I mean, in a sense, getting the Blackfriars Trial was a bit of a victory for Wolsey, getting it in place at all, getting the agreement in principle that the divorce case could be tried in England rather than in Rome. So Catherine of Aragon was very keen for the case to be heard in Rome before all the cardinals, and you can see why from her point of view that made sense. There was a lot more influence for her side in Rome. There was a lot more kind of military pressure, the metaphorical tanks on the lawn, or sort of arquebuses in the battlefield, if you prefer, you know. So having the case called to Rome would have been a good thing from her point of view. Wolsey and Henry had to some extent won by getting that case tried in England. They had got their first choice of papal legate, Cardinal Campeggio, who of course we know had spent a long period of time in England. He'd in fact been so favoured by the English court that they had given him a palace in Rome, you know, given him a present of a very nice house in Rome. I mean, he
Lovely.
was somebody who theoretically, in their minds, might well have owed them a favour.
Yeah, right.
So he
should
was
have
kind
been
of
on side.
he should have been on side, but there were already some warning signs. The journey had been delayed. It had taken them 2 years of diplomacy even to get this far. Some of the diplomats who had been in Rome in early 1529, like Sir Francis Bryan, were writing back saying, you know, we've tried fair means and foul and we cannot move the Pope. So they were a little bit sceptical, and I think there were those sort of warning signs that the Pope wasn't prepared to concede very much. So Campeggio very slowly, suffering from gout, has this painful journey over to England, and we get to the Legatine Court at Blackfriars. And this is meant to settle the matter. Supposedly Campeggio has in his luggage the paperwork that will allow them to make the final decision on behalf of the Pope there and then in England without it ever having to go to Rome.
Right.
Catherine, meanwhile, is trying desperately to get those letters sent out to get the case advoked, to use a technical term, to Rome.
And so Campeggio and Wolsey preside over this court, don't they?
Yes, exactly.
What happens?
I think Campeggio is hoping that things will never need to come to court because Catherine will concede. Campeggio appears to spend quite a bit of time trying for a compromise solution, which is that Catherine will take religion, that she will accept the annulment of her marriage, and that she will retire to a convent, and no doubt with a generous settlement everything will be fine. And Catherine does not budge. I mean, not only does she not budge in the face of Campeggio's pressure to say we can do without this diplomatic issue right now, please can you just agree to this, and she says absolutely not. She turns up at court, which is not expected, and makes a kind of very famous sort of speech declaring her side of the case. And in the meantime, her agents in Rome are getting the case advoked and collapsing the Legatine Court. And I think one of the things about this case, the whole of the divorce, is that there are two barriers standing in Henry's way. One of them is Catherine, and Catherine's own sort of self-perception of herself as a princess of Spain, you know, a member of a royal family who ought not to be treated like that, and as a mother who is fiercely interested in the future of her daughter and does not want her daughter to be declared illegitimate. So, you know, I think they underestimate Catherine, and I think they also underestimate what the Venetian ambassador at the time called Clement VII's infinite desire for Florence, and Clement VII's desire to get his family back into power in Florence, which he's only going to pull off with the help of Catherine's relatives. So those two people stand in the way. And it's, I think a lot of the time people think that this is about the Pope being, you know, serious about the theology of not wanting to dissolve marriages. So that absolutely nothing to do with it. It's all about the Pope having his own private political family interests in a military alliance with the Spanish.
It just so happened to align with Catherine's
It's lucky for Catherine. I mean, if it had been a case where the French and Spanish sides were kind of fairly evenly balanced and English troops in subsidy could have tipped the difference, then you might well have had a Pope saying, do you know what, actually, yeah, I need Henry as an ally. I'm going to side with him, but it doesn't work like that.
He doesn't really need Henry. At the same time, I presume the reason the Pope didn't just say no and come on full side with Catherine was that he didn't want to disaffect Henry to the point where, you know, I think there was, am I right in saying that Wolsey was beginning to fear that it would have a serious impact on the Church of Rome in England if Clement absolutely put his foot down and said, no, this isn't going to happen?
Yeah, I think that Clement wants the diplomatic solution. I think Clement plays politics very carefully and doesn't want to be seen as favouring one side of the war in Italy too heavily. So the French are not doing particularly well in the Italian wars at this point, but they're not a negligible power. They've got quite a lot of influence, and England has gotten back into an alliance with France. So Clement has to think a little bit about not wanting to alienate England's French allies too much. He needs to think about not giving the Holy Roman Empire and Catherine's relatives everything they want either, because you don't want to give too many concessions straight off. You need to sort of walk a little bit of a line, and I'd say try and maintain that impression that what you are doing is following the rules and following the law in all of this, and not just playing politics with it.
Obviously things didn't quite go to plan in that trial, or perhaps as Wolsey had hoped. So when do you think that Wolsey began to get a sense that things weren't really going in the direction that Henry and Anne had anticipated from that trial?
The Blackfriars Court ends with the case being advoked to Rome, and so the legatine powers are neither here nor there. Campeggio and Wolsey aren't allowed to make the final decision. That's now going to be made in Rome. And at that point, Wolsey's strategy, 2 years plus of diplomacy and negotiations and saying we can persuade the Pope, has come to nothing. And Henry is now going to have to look to other avenues. And Wolsey, as a cardinal, because he's part of the College of Cardinals, he's part of that structure of the Church in Rome. If you're going to look for ways to challenge the power of the Church, then actually having somebody who's very heavily tied into it, to the point of, back in 1517, having promoted himself briefly as a candidate for Pope, that's a kind of awkward situation. And Wolsey's whole career has been built on getting Henry what Henry wants, and it becomes clear in the middle of 1529 that he can no longer do that. So he's going to fall from power. Now, whether or not he's going to fall permanently from power, whether he's going to have a little bit of a kind of awkward moment and then come back to future glories, that I think is still a little bit of an open question. But at this stage, no.
Can only imagine how Wolsey must have felt coming back home from the Blackfriars Trial, and he must have had a stiff drink when he got home.
Yes, I can imagine he would have needed a drink.
Bad day at the office. Bad day at the office. I'm interested really in finding out a bit more about what you think about the man. You've spent a lot of time researching and writing about the King's great matter, and therefore, of course, Wolsey. What do you think are his most favourable characteristics?
He's a great administrator, and from Henry's point of view, he does that job of getting things done. I mean, he organises things, he reforms things, he puts in place all the new Eltham ordinances for the royal household. He manages all sorts of very complex political projects. He manages international diplomatic treaties. He is a hugely effective administrator. He is getting, on a small scale, reform of the church underway. I mean, it's interesting, you sort of talk about the Reformation as something that happens afterwards, but lots of people within the Catholic Church were very conscious that there was a generalised need for reform, not in the Protestant type of reform, but Wolsey was somebody who was already reorganising monastic foundations, endowing colleges. So you get this sort of person who really is a kind of man of many parts. And he's that diplomat and administrator. He's a patron of art. He's of course responsible for overseeing the architecture at Hampton Court. This incredibly splendid Renaissance court in England, perhaps more so than Henry himself in some cases. I mean, it's not a surprise that Henry decides to help himself to Hampton Court, which is Wolsey's great palace, but a lot of people resent him for it. because he's come from this relatively low-born background.
And on the other hand, I'm also really interested to hear what you might think would be Wolsey's Achilles heel. What was his downfall in terms of his personality? Perhaps you might have some thoughts to share with us on that.
I would say it's underestimating women. He underestimates, I think, what Anne Boleyn aspires to. He thinks she can be persuaded to settle for that kind of role as royal mistress. He underestimates Catherine of Aragon's determination not to back down. And I think in that, you know, if you had to think about one thing that really he miscalculates around, it's that sort of individual obstinacy that doesn't go along with your sort of political diplomatic pragmatism, but is about, no, actually, I personally really want things to be this way, and I am going to stick with it. I'm not going to compromise. I'm not going to sort of accept the dynastic rules. I'm going to make my own rules. And I think Wolsey has, you know, come up with this sort of way of seeing how things should work. And then he runs up against these people who are
these two forces of nature.
These two very forceful women in their own ways who are not going to give in. And I think that's that is that, you know, one real challenge for him.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Yeah, very, very good point. So if you met Wolsey today, Catherine, what would be the one single question that you would like to ask him?
Do you ever regret not moving to Rome?
Okay.
He could have done what his predecessor as Cardinal of York did, Christopher Bainbridge, moved his household to Rome, had a very nice life, playing politics in the Roman Curia, all those kind of intellectual circles, lovely climate, not the level of rain you get down in England, none of that sort of hassle that you get at Henry's court, the very cosmopolitan, international sort of environment. Did you ever sort of sit there in that last year and look back and say, do you know what, I wish when they'd made me a cardinal, I'd just upped sticks and moved south?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. What do you think he would have said in reply?
Oh, I mean, you know, I'm sure, you know, at some point he considered that option, but, you know, he wouldn't have done it. I suspect he didn't regret it. I suspect he would say that, no, I, you know, had the life I wanted here in England. There was a big job to do. I liked being at the English court.
Yeah, and the power.
And the power, yes, and the power, and you're at the centre of it all. But, you know, who knows? You know, could he have been Pope?
Yeah, who knows? If he'd have been over there in Rome,
if he'd been over there building the alliances, would he have been seen as a nice sort of neutral option candidate when he was on the spot in one or other of those elections?
Interesting.
Who can say? Could he have been a longer-lived Adrian VI?
Well, we are going to be moving on in our next videos to talk about, actually, you touched on Wolsey as a patron of the arts. We're going to be talking about Wolsey's Hampton Court, and we're also going to be covering Wolsey's downfall. But I think you've taken us quite nicely up to that point where he's really starting to teeter on the edge of his power. So thank you so much for sharing your passion and your insight on this subject with us today. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure that our viewers do at home as well. Thank you so much, Catherine.
Thank you for having me.